So, as early as the late 12th and 13th centuries, artists began to depict the violin in paintings, giving testimony to its presence in the musical world. The cello, however, or bass violin, as far as records depict, did not come into existence until the 15th century. The reason for the late appearance of the deeper voiced member of the violin family was, at least part, due to the evolution of the timbral ideal in Western European music at the time. Due to the long-held dominance of vocal music over the musical scene during this time, it was only natural that the sonic ideals of instrumental timbre would be determined by the trends of singers at that time. Performance practice in vocal music, for example, until the 15th century, demanded a tone which was very high-pitched and nasal, producing a sound we would more closely associate with Eastern music nowadays. Similarly, string instruments at this time adopted this nasal sound, and if we just have a listen to some of the earliest cellos. I'm sure you'll agree that that sound is rather different from the sound that we expect to hear from cellos nowadays. This changed, however, with the compositions of the Flemish school that was led by Johannes Ockeghem, who was himself a bass singer and a pioneer of early complex contrapuntal writing. The vocal range was extended during Ockeghem's reign, and the lower end eventually led to a low C. At the same time, the timbral ideal shifted to the more rounded, open tone in singing and instrumental music that we know and love today. It was under these circumstances that the bass violin, or great bass viol as you see here, actually began to make its place in the musical world. Over time, the name violoncello developed from violon, the large viola, and cello, an Italian term meaning small or subordinate. So, the direct translation of this violoncello would read, a little large viola, demonstrating that this new instrument was somewhat a confused hybrid at the time. The instrument continued to evolve completely separately from the viola da gamba, an instrument which was held by the performer's palms and had varying numbers of strings. Although the cello was held in a similar way, it had no frets and had a dramatically different shape, producing a unique, more resonant and rounded tone. The role of the cello was very diverse in its first 200 years, usually participating in the accompaniment and bass line of various forms of music, both secular and sacred. Indeed, it has recently come to light that the organum parts in sacred medieval polyphony may not have been sung as musicologists thought for a long time, but were in fact played on instruments by members of the string family. In the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, the members of the violin family were considered particularly appropriate for sacred music. However, the instruments were not used exclusively in these roles. The artistic depictions indicate that they were used for all kinds of events, from weddings to raucous music making in the village and taverns, as you can see in this informal setting. In his history of the violoncello, the viola da gamba, their precursors and collateral instruments, Edmund van der Straaten states frequently that the level of technical achievement on the cello was extremely backward and could in no way compare with that of the violin or the viola da gamba. At times, however, he points to evidence which is quite to the contrary. One example is his description of the virtuoso duel between the cellist Tonelli and the violinist D'Anvers in the early 18th century, which was apparently so spectacular that the audience, and I quote, broke out in rapturous applause at the end. If there did exist full-blown virtuoso cellists, it is strange the utter lack of solo repertoire that existed up until the middle of the 17th century. Nona Pyrie, in her supplement to William Peet's publication Cello, offers one possible explanation for this fact. The discrepancy, she says, between the great volume of music for the violin in the 17th century and the dearth of it for the cello can be best understood in the light of only two factors. First, idiomatic writing for a specific instrument was only just beginning to develop in people's thinking. And secondly, even the early idiomatic writing for the violin did not necessarily exclude the deeper voices of the violin family. Cellists considering themselves to be violinists, albeit bass violinists, quite naturally actually adopted the violin repertoire as their own, transposing it down a notch, making no distinction between the various voices within the family of violins that do singers today with their solo repertoire. As I previously stated, it was not until the late 17th century that the first pieces for solo cello, or accompanied cello for that matter, were written. The most common form for a piece was the Recital. The Baroque Recital was an instrumental piece, not too lengthy, and in many cases only for one instrument. It had several different functions in the musical society of the time. Firstly, as a vehicle for secular instrumental expression, and secondly, in the church service, in alternation with the choir, either during the offertory, or before the psalms. During these performances, the organist would improvise freely on a sacred or secular melody, in a fantasy or prelude. Sometimes this involved a touch of the profane creeping into the church service if it was not a sacred melody on which the organist was improvising. Sometimes the Recital would consist of a piece for more than one instrument, in which case the theme was passed from one part to another to establish an imitative counterpoint without too much development. It's not possible to establish a perfectly consistent form for these pieces. The connecting link between this and the presence of a simple theme in a definite key and rhythm which established the tonal centre and the character of the piece overall. An example can be seen here. The compositions published this time bring to light the larger question regarding the role of the performer and the composer. Many compositions omitted information that many performers today would consider to be vital for an authentic realization of these compositions. Leo Treitler, in Source Readings in Music History, sheds some light on the situation. He claims that, during this time, the importance of improvisation when realizing compositions was far more prominent than in later epochs. The divide between composer and performer was not nearly as clear as it seems to be in today's society. Composers were often performers themselves during this time, realizing their own compositions in formal and informal settings, and the use of improvisations in solo cadenza passages within concerti, slow reflective movements in suites, and processional sections of sacred services were commonplace. It was not until the introduction of patronage and the deification of the labouring composer genius during later epochs in music history that ideals regarding the importance of composer and performer were solidified. This, however, is an entirely different musicological matter, but is worth bearing in mind as we turn our ears and eyes to the extracts of the remainder of the lecture. The art of accompaniment was a special skill that was prioritised by cellists in the 18th and early 19th centuries in cello method practices. The accompanying cellist was seen as a subordinate partner to the principal melodic line, instrumental or vocal, in aria, melody, and recitative. Required skills for the cellist in this role included the regulation of time, such as rhythm, meter, and tempo, in an ensemble, and the expressive articulation of musical character through the sensitive and appropriate use of bow strokes. There is some disagreement, however, about adding ornaments to the bass in early sources, although this apparently was practiced by the English cellist Robert Lindley well into the 19th century. J.B. Baumgartner's Instruction de musique à l'usage du violoncelle, excuse my French, from 1774, provides detailed advice for cellists about how to accompany recitatives and harmonically embellish a bass line. However, this was quite uncommon during the time. Several 18th century musicians advocated the use of larger sized instruments for the purposes of accompaniment in order to balance the timbre and also the pitch. The birth of the virtuoso violoncellist came in the 18th century, with many composer performers choosing to write for the newly established and, by this stage, incredibly 9 extant continuous sonatas and 27 concertos for the cello. It is with this in mind that we turn to the first movement of the cello concerto in G minor. As you listen to Janice play this excerpt from the opening Ritornello, look out for her Baroque bows. Bows at this time were looser, more light, and also they bent in the opposite direction, as you saw in the viola da gamba. She will also play closer to the fingerboard in order to get a more authentic sound, and also notice how very little vibrato is used in this opening excerpt. In 1730, Johann Sebastian Bach orchestra at Leipzig had 2 cellists and 1 violon player. But later, by the second half of the same century, the number of cellists in the German court orchestras began to increase, balancing the expanding wind and brass sections. In the court orchestra of the Prussian court, for example, the ratio of cellos to basses were 4:2 in 1754, then 6:3 in 1783, and 8:4 in 1787. Unfortunately, this expansion would not have been witnessed by arguably the most famous composer from this time, Bach. The 6 solo suites by Bach, along with numerous obbligato parts in cantatas and Brandenburg concertos, are anomalous in the German music from this period, since music written specifically for the cello before the middle of the 18th century is extremely rare. Characteristics of these 6 suites include complicated bowing patterns, the use of batteries, which is the use of multiple fingers playing pizzicato on the same string in fast scaling passages, bariolage, which is a French term which means an odd mixture of colours and directs the string player to achieve a contrast in tone colours by playing on different strings. An example of bariolage is when the same note is played alternating between open strings and stopped strings, or by playing a repeating passage oscillating between the 2, 3, or 4 strings. An example from the first suite, as you may be able to make out here, we have a number of repeating A's as the music comes back. Some stems going up, some stems going down. Those notes were to be played on alternating strings in a different position. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Such trends were far more common in violin or violin repertoire during this time, not for the German cello. Arpeggios, multiple stoppings, chords, and a high degree of left-hand virtuosity in the positions of the neck were also present in the suites. At the end of today's lecture, you will hear the prelude from suite number 3, played by Janice. And as you listen, think about when this music was composed. It has extensive hand positions. It has numerous string crossings and double stoppings, which was very uncommon for music for the cello at this time. Later in the 18th century, and now in Austria, the cello continued its ascent to the virtuosic star in both chamber and orchestral music. The cellists in the employ of the Kapelle de Prinzerhazy at the time of Haydn's association with the court, for example, provided the stimulus for an expanding repertoire of significant works for the cello and the emergence of a role distinct from its traditional bassline accompaniment function
of earlier ensembles. The Concerto in C is a musical masterpiece and a virtuosic showpiece for any cellist. It uses techniques similar to those employed by an earlier composer, Fils, in his concertos dating from the 1750s. Fast passages implying the use of horizontal thumb position, fingerings across 3 strings in blocked hand positions, arpeggios, batteries, double stops alternating with lower open strings, and lower register sonorities are all included. The range of the cello extends to incredibly high A in the first movement alone, and 2 octaves above middle C. Now that sonata form had been securely fastened in the staple musical diet at the time, a first movement of a multi-movement work such as concerto, symphony, sonata, or string quartet, Haydn sought to explore the virtuosic capabilities of his performers, maintaining the balance and regularity that was so admired during this age of reason and elegance. As we listen to Janice play the robust and triumphant opening to Haydn's cello concerto in C, consider how the range of the cello compares with that of the Vivaldi concerto. For example, notice Janice's left hand as she scales the heights of the fingerboard, moving into thumb position before she attacks the majestic double stops with a blocked hand position with rigor. Over to you, was not as blurred as during the Baroque era, and although improvised passages still continue to be used in compositions, the role of the composer was definitely beginning to change. Due to patronage, the growth of importance of a conductor as a musical director, and the death of the basso continuo tradition, compositions became more fixed, and also, as a result, composers began to include more detailed direction, expression markings, and technical requests of their performers. The cadenza, the solo passage in the concerto that allows for the performer to show off their technical brilliance, unaccompanied by the orchestra, was often improvised. In fact, during Vivaldi's time, it was commonplace to have these improvisatory passages. Often, the performers of works were the authors themselves during this time, and so the passages that required spontaneous creativity would have been realized by the composer themselves. Arguably, this is a generalization. However, the same principle would not be true in the classical period due to the change in the importance of the role of the composer. The cadenza of Haydn's cello concerto in C major, for example, was actually written by the composer himself in order to capture his intentions before publication. The larger question of the role of performer and composer was changing due to those extra musical factors. The cadenza that Janice is now going to play was composed in the 18th century by the composer himself. It makes brilliant use of the motifs from the first and second subjects of the opening movement, whilst also displaying her virtuosity as she ascends once again up the fingerboard. Over to you, Janice. shifts, exposed solo lines and contrast in moods during this excerpt. There are passages where Janice makes use of no vibrato, for example in the left hand, and implements instead vibrato using her bow. She gradually adds vibrato back in the left hand, towards the end of the excerpt before returning to the tonic key. Over to you, Janice. A number of other first-rate works by preeminent 19th century composers feature the cello prominently. Works with the piano include 2 sonatas by Mendelssohn, 1 sonata and several shorter pieces by Chopin also. The cello's capacity for cantilena playing in the tenor register, as well as for playing accompanying bass and tenor lines, is exploited by Romantic composers for dramatic and melodic effects in chamber works as well as solo repertoire. Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms, Tchaikovsky and Dvorak all wrote string quartets, quintets, trios and other works which contain prominent cello parts. The role of the cello in large and small ensembles in the 19th century followed the practice established in orchestral and chamber compositions of the last decades of the 18th century. The increasing number of cellist composers enlarged the solo repertory, developing with it an expanded range of virtuoso techniques for both the left hand and the bow, although many compositions written by cellists for their own concert performances have failed the test of time. The core of the late 19th century repertory for solo cello and orchestra consists of Schumann's cello concerto in A minor, Brahms' double concerto, Dvorak's concerto in B minor, Tchaikovsky's Rococo variations, Lalo's concerto in D minor, and the first in A minor. There's dramatic emotional contrasts and expressive vibrato throughout, very different from the excerpts we have listened to so far today. The contrast in emotions, for example, something that was first developed by Beethoven but embraced fully by later composers, is demonstrated when we juxtapose the first and second movements. This concerto is quite unique in that it is composed in one movement with separate subsections, with no pauses between the so-called movements. The vast array of different moods and emotions throughout the piece are therefore presented in an even more compelling manner than we heard in Beethoven. Huge contrast in dynamics and range, showing the new capabilities of the cello now that it is developed technologically as well in light of the Industrial Revolution. Also, listen for the gradation in dynamics as the music has dramatic crescendos and diminuendos. With the proliferation of cellists the world over, the extraordinary development in the technique of the instrument, under the guidance and great teacher performance, and the ways in which composers have accepted the challenges these developments that we are about to hear offer. After Saint-Saëns and during the 20th century, musicians turned, rather than composing, to technical performance. pioneers included May Nuckel, Suja, and Beatrice Harrison. Paul Tortelier devised the longer angled spike, which was also adopted by Rostropovich. By raising the point at which the bow touches the strings and the incline of the upper strings towards the horizontal, it is said to be easier for the left hand to negotiate the upper part of the fingerboard. However, most cellists today employ the shorter, straight end pin as you see on Janice's cello. Some, following Pleath, are of the opinion that too much emphasis is placed on technical perfection and would like to see a better marriage between technique and creative musicality. Casals himself said, 2 things are essential, method and instinct. He also maintained that, since his pupils had so many different opinions about his approach, it was proof that he never treated the same student the same way. From all of these developments, we can see that the cello eventually became the brilliant solo and chamber instrument that it is today. During the 15th and 16th centuries, musicians came not only to accept, but also to admire the sound of the instrument. Then, in the 17th century, performers achieved a level of virtuosity to inspire the composers of the time to write, idiomatically, for them. Many great works were to follow, including the 6 suites of J.S. Bach from the beginning of the 18th century. The concertos of Haydn followed, and before long, the repertoire for the cello was a size to be reckoned with. The importance of the cello was secured in the world of Western music for all time. Now that the instrument has reached a secure and stable form, attention has turned to not only the increasing repertory, but also technique. As a consequence, there is now a fresh conception of what can be achieved on the cello. 2-bow technique, microtones, harmonics both natural and artificial, variations in vibrato speed, extreme finger extensions, extended tessitura, and so on. Janice will now play the prelude from Suite No. 3 in C major, written by Bach. experience and learnt a little bit more about the cello and its repertoire. I would just like to, before I welcome you to go out and have some more refreshments, I would also like to thank both Janice and Miss Kim, who have given up their evening and a lot of practice time in order to provide the musical examples for this evening, and I'm sure you'll agree they both deserve at least one more round.